Today on the Bible Reading Challenge podcast, we are going to give an overview of the book of Leviticus. My name is Aaron Ventura, and I'm joined today by Dr. Tim Edwards. Dr. Edwards, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
And this is like season 2, so you made it.
I made it through season 2.
You did good enough on season 1. And people can figure out who didn't get invited back.
I'm not sort of being asked to talk about Leviticus, so I don't know whether that can ever be described as making it.
Yeah. You got stuck with Leviticus. I thought, should I have one of the Gray Friars? I was like, there's no chance I'm going to ask one of the Gray Friars to do this. I think I asked Zach Wilkie to research the book of Numbers, and I gave him that fun task. Said, hey, if you want to do this, you're going to need to come with your research. So read some books so that you can tell us about Numbers.
Okay.
But let's see how you do with Leviticus. So today we are in the graveyard of sorts for many a Bible reading challenge plans. Exodus had some hard stuff. You get the tabernacle, garments, and descriptions of furniture. And you're like, okay, are we going to get back to some fun stories? But the first 8 chapters of Leviticus are just sacrificial rituals. So before we get into the content, what is this book about? What function does it play in the first 5 books of Moses?
Obviously, Exodus finishes with these long descriptions, as you said, of the. I mean, it's remarkably repetitive in one way. God takes a lot of time to describe to Moses the tabernacle. Yeah. And then they take a lot of time describing them doing it and then putting it up.
We followed it to the T, yeah.
We followed it. It's like, do we really need that many chapters on that? Leviticus starts describing what is happening in that tabernacle, the laws of the sacrifices, then the consecration of Aaron and the priesthood.
Yep.
It all going badly wrong straight away.
Some people die.
Funnily enough. And so it's very much predominantly talking about the cult, ritualistic cult of the tabernacle and thus the future temple.
Yeah.
And then it's focused on what seem to be miscellaneous laws, many of which are to do with impurity and purity, which are clearly related to the presence of God in their midst in the tabernacle.
Yeah.
And then you have these blessings and curses at the end, which seem, covenant related, similar to the ones that you find in the end of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
So it's predominantly priestly, cultic.
Yeah.
In its focus and orientation, it seems.
Okay. So one of the things people are going to come across a lot in this book is this clean, unclean idea. Can you explain maybe how that could be misinterpreted? Are we talking that they need to wear masks and use hand sanitizer or something else?
Yeah, so it's been discussed at length in various contexts and places. It's not the equivalent of hygiene.
Okay. So this wasn't how God just kept Israel from getting sick?
No. It may have that may have been a byproduct.
Yeah.
But no. It's all to do with the reality that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is dwelling in their midst. And he is holy. And therefore there are certain actions that are not wrong in and of themselves that make you impure. And impurity comes from 3 main sources: corpses, certain genital discharge, and foods, different types of foods and actions. So there are these sources of impurity which aren't related to moral or immoral actions.
Yeah.
So, put it this way: in order to obey the first commandment, to be fruitful and multiply, you have to become unclean. You have to become impure.
Yeah.
In order to discharge your what was considered the ultimate way of honouring your parents, you had to undergo the most severe case of ritual impurity by contact with the corpse. So it's not about sin or not. It's this concept of certain things make you impure.
Yeah.
And I think in the whole, it's really pedagogical in teaching that God is in your midst.
Yeah.
And He is radically other than you, and you cannot just be any old how.
Yeah.
And turn up any old how into His midst. It certainly sets holiness apart in such a way that it's quite a scary thing to have God amongst you.
Yeah.
Now, why is that impure? Why does it make you impure? Why does that make you pure? Why does washing for a certain level of impurity deal with it? And for corpse impurity, you have to sacrifice an animal.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you the reason.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain why. A lot of people say that the impurity laws are tied in some form of way to death. And death is on a spectrum of life to death, not just being dead yourself. And that seems to have some value to it as an understanding. But I don't think anyone has, solved the issue definitively.
Yeah. So, so far in the story of Israel, God has brought them out of bondage. He's fulfilling this promise to Abraham. And then He's taking Israel. He says, they're my firstborn son, and I'm going to set you apart from these other nations. And then this is kind of like the, the marriage laws. This is kind of like God's house rules, maybe for, if I'm going to dwell with you, you can't put your feet on the coffee table. And maybe if you're a kid, you don't quite understand why you can't jump on the couch or do this or that. But you just know that because he said so, you can't.
Yeah, there's a degree of that, but we also have the notion of clean and unclean animals in Genesis with Noah.
Yeah.
So pre the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, pre-Moses, you have a notion that isn't explained, that there are certain animals that are clean and unclean, and the unclean ones you don't offer. So that is, the principle is there pre-Moses, pre-Sinai, it's not explained. So there is an element that is the case, and obviously we have to take into account Paul's description of the function of the law, and this is part of that law, in that it's there to train and teach Israel under its time of immaturity, in order to keep it and to preserve them, but also in order to teach them their need for Christ.
Yeah.
And so we have to, I think the purity and impurity laws are all part of that, and they don't disappear in one sense in the New Testament. In that sense, those questions are still present amongst the church, and Paul deals with some of them, and obviously the Gospels, purity and impurity is a big issue for them.
Yeah, reading through Leviticus again, and then thinking about if you were a Jew hearing a sermon like Hebrews, say, and your whole life has been informed by who you can eat with, what you can and can't touch, even the festival calendar, and then suddenly they're preaching that those things, you don't have to become that way to get close to God. I can imagine why they persecuted Paul, right? Because it's radically upsetting the norm. It's completely changing it.
There is clearly a big disturbance in their world. That the righteousness that they were pursuing was not the righteousness that God was looking for. Paul understood that when he met Jesus on the Damascus Road. Suddenly realized all this righteousness I have, and it's genuine righteousness. He's, a Torah observant Jew. He's trying to living in accordance with the law, and he suddenly realized that's not sufficient. It's not what God wanted. So that does turn things on its head. It does. That's very true.
So the first 7 or 8 chapters are talking about these 5 sacrificial offerings. First, for the people, what they need to do, and then the priests kind of what their little manual for handling the sacrifices are. So it says in Hebrews 10:4, it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. And when a lot of people read that, they just think, well, why did God have them go through these very tedious exercises? So we mentioned that it's pedagogical. Can you expand a little bit more on that? And even in some of the Psalms, it's like you don't want a sacrifice, you want something else, but he commands the sacrifice. So how do we, live in that tension?
So I remember many years ago just going through the Torah and Leviticus, particularly, although there are laws of sacrifices in other books, and just sort of working out what sacrifices need to be done just because.
Yeah.
No one has sinned. No one's offering a special offering. It's just the daily requirement. And there was, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's morning and evening, every day. There are certain times there's well over 1,000 sacrifices without anything being done, any sin being committed or anything. Just for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who made the world to dwell amongst Israel. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself says something.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms of the prophetic criticisms of Israel, and throughout history is, you have no idea who I am. You thought I was altogether like you.
Yeah.
I'm not. And the sacrificial system, in one sense, is underlining that all the time. Mm-hmm. God is dangerous.
Yeah.
Pure light, pure holiness, pure goodness and truth is a terrifying thing when you're a fallen, sinful human being. So I think sacrifice underlines that, and then in the Psalms, when they realize what's the death of a sheep going to do?
Yeah.
For me, in relationship to the God who created the world, they understand that that's strange.
Yeah.
And Psalm 52, I think it's 52, God says, if I were hungry, I would not tell you.
Yeah.
I own everything. It really is not, so the position of faith for an ancient Israelite with the sacrificial system was, God, you're doing this, you've asked us to do this, even though this goat in and of itself cannot, this death of this goat cannot make me pure and cannot satisfy your holiness. And so in one sense I'm doing it in faith, because you are going to provide a way for this to work in some way. And I think those, as time went on, that awareness of there would be an ultimate sacrifice. Isaiah 52 and 53 clearly is portraying that the servant of the Lord was going to take upon himself those sins. So that awareness that these sacrifices were looking forward to the one true sacrifice, I think, is there present in the Old Testament. Yeah.
There's this kind of idea in evangelicalism that now that Christ has come, it's all faith, but in the Old Testament, the Israelites were saved by works and by keeping these sacrifices. Can you explain a little bit more of how actually they were saved, what the Scripture says about that, and what kind of messianic expectation or how much knowledge did your average Israelite have when they were putting their hands on the bull or the kid or whatever it is? And do we have any indication that they knew what they were doing, like Hebrews would describe, or they didn't?
I think we have to take what Hebrews says very genuinely, very seriously, obviously.
Part 1, take it seriously. It's God's word.
And you ask the question, well, how have they reached that conclusion? Because Peter's sermon in Acts 2 I found very helpful in this question, is because he's talking about Psalm 16, and which is a messianic psalm about Jesus not being forsaken to Sheol or Hades, and therefore dying but not staying dead and rising again. And Peter says that David, knowing what God had promised him, knew that one of his descendants would need to rise from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it wasn't going to be Absalom.
and it wasn't Absalom, David has been made these promises by God. To 2 Samuel 7 talks about that, and Psalm 89 and others give you more details. But David has sat down and go, you have promised something about my offspring, which means that one of them is going to have to die and rise again, never again to die, in order for that to be true.
Yeah.
Let me write a psalm about that. Off he goes. That's how Peter seems to be implying that Psalm 16 came about. So David has that expectation. You could argue that it's a general expectation, although it seems quite specific. There needs to be a death and a resurrection. And so I have no problem with people at various points in Old Testament history taking seriously the things that God has said and reaching conclusions about what the future redemption is going to look like. He's training them right from day one to understand that the history that he is leading them through and the events that they are experiencing are themselves signposts and signify something beyond themselves. So when Paul says that the Israelites were all baptized into Moses, walking through the Red Sea was a type of baptism.
Yeah.
I can't imagine many of the Israelites walking there going, baptism.
Yeah.
You can't imagine that. But I could imagine when they start hearing the laws about washings and clearing away impurities and putting oneself in a position where one can worship God in the sanctuary. Well, I can imagine someone going, we just went through a big river.
Yeah.
That could, that's preparing us for something.
Yeah.
And as the laws came in, and as the prophets speak into the situation, in one sense, the vision of the future, the hope of the future becomes more and more defined and clear. The Song of the Sea. We're not talking about Leviticus much, but it's the same principle. All the Israelites come out and they start singing about the sanctuary that God has prepared and is built and is established for them to go into. No law has been given about the sanctuary at that point.
Yeah.
Nothing, but there's an expectation that redemption is leading somewhere. And I think they had a life of faith. Hebrews tells us Moses chose the sufferings of Christ rather than the riches of Egypt.
Yeah.
It tells us that the wilderness generation would preach the gospel, but they didn't mix it with faith. That wasn't the gospel as we preach it today, retrospectively, having seen Jesus rise and die and rise again, but it was the content of that gospel.
Yeah.
It's not a different gospel. They weren't told, your gospel is this.
Yeah.
Our gospel is that. It's the same truth. It's just it's less clearly delineated in the Old Testament in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's in Galatians where Paul says that Abraham, saw, he heard the gospel, and if he's getting this promise that in his seed all the nations are going to be blessed, I mean, it's a crazy promise, and you're wondering, okay, how that's going to happen. Can you talk a little bit about, so now his seed has been formed as a nation. What function does the tabernacle, these sacrifices, even the way they are arrayed as a people, how does that connect to blessing the nations?
That's a good question. Not been asked that one before. Thanks. I mean, the striking thing about the tabernacle is you have Sinai, you have this theophany, fire, smoke, the sound, thunder and lightning, and the sound of a voice, whether it's verbal or it's hard to know exactly what they hear, and there's fear and trembling, and everyone's like, and we're not going near that place.
Yeah.
That presence, once the tabernacle is built, transfers from the mountain to the camp.
Yeah.
And the Israelite camp is structured with the tabernacle as the main focus.
So portable holy mountain is how it's described.
But it's with the people. And there's a Jewish interpretive tradition which is designed to make a very true theological point. It says as Adam sinned and left the garden, there were sort of 7 generations, including Adam, of wickedness, and God was sent into exile. And then you had righteous men, and he came back from exile, and the final act was the erection of the tabernacle, and God came and dwelt with man. Now, whatever you think of the structure and things like that, the point was this, that God's intention was always to dwell with his people. That's where he wanted to be.
Yeah.
He wanted to be with his redeemed people. And John clearly picks that up because the incarnation is communicated as a tabernacle.
Yeah.
The Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. And so Israel is a blessing to the nations. The tabernacle is an indicative of God wanting to dwell with his people. And that people had Gentiles attached to it.
Yeah.
Predominantly Israelite, predominantly descendants of Abraham, according to the flesh, but it wasn't a mixed company, and it was teaching Israel and teaching the world. It's a light to the nations. That's where God wants to be. God wants to dwell amongst his people. He wants a people whom he's in fellowship with. And it pointed towards the incarnation and Christ coming, and that body becoming a universal body. And the sacrifices are, you can't just dwell with God any old how.
Yeah.
It's teaching you there's something that that needs to be overcome, it needs to be dealt with in order for that fellowship to take place. Sin, moral impurity, ritual impurity, all these things are barriers, and all of which are part and parcel of our state as fallen human beings, are barriers to that, and we need to be aware that needs to be dealt with. And in the law, God is providing a way for that, for Old Testament Israel to experience that fellowship with God. And that law is pointed to, ultimately, the fulfillment of all those sacrifices.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of sacrifices, all that blood covers every aspect of our relationship with God, is dealt with in that one sacrifice outside of Jerusalem.
Yeah. So René Girard, the French anthropologist, talks a whole lot about sacrifice, and he basically argues that man is this sacrificing being. It's just something we do, and he looks at all these cultures in which sacrifice just everyone does it, and then Christ comes and it changed the world in that regard, and it has me thinking about the way God doesn't abolish sacrifice, and doubtless people were sacrificing their children, or there's a reason the Canaanites are going to get wiped out, but God does have them sacrificing animals, and it's meant to somehow meet this impulse where at least the ancients knew that you had to kill something to make the gods happy, whether it was for crops or to win in battle or something. And it seems like now, especially in our secular modern culture, we're dumber than the ancient pagans in that we don't think there's any real relationship between heaven and earth. Any other thoughts or comments on?
No, I think it's a profound idea, because the ancient Near Eastern world in which Israel was a part had a plethora of gods and goddesses. for every area of life. In other words, they understood if you needed a baby, if you needed your crops to succeed, there are things, those are things outside of your control. They're outside of your domain, your competency, and therefore you have the gods and goddesses, these little figures you can bring out, little sacrifice to, and hopefully it will work.
Yeah.
That's the ancient Near Eastern world. And those gods and goddesses are tied to different areas. Israel comes along and says, there is one God.
Yeah. And he's invisible.
And he's invisible, and don't make an image of him, and he's got all of those bases covered.
Yeah.
All of them. And in one sense, the laws of Leviticus cover lots of those bases.
Yeah.
They cover all those bases in terms of God deals with all of those things.
Yeah.
Now, the modern world is further from the truth than that ancient Near Eastern world that Israel lived in, and at least that ancient world understood that there are large areas of life that are beyond our competency.
Yeah.
Crops, having children, the weather, all those things. We now think we've got that covered.
Yeah.
We're good.
Yeah.
We don't need God in any of those things. And in one sense, technology is just one long pursuit to reduce our dependence on anything or anyone other than ourselves.
Yeah.
God, is kind enough to come put the spanner in the works now and again
Yeah.
for people. But for Israel, imagine a situation. We talk about the Jew-Gentile transformation in the New Testament and what a big deal that was.
Yeah.
And in the Roman world, the slave and the master, suddenly they were sitting at the same table, with the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
That's dramatic. Imagine growing up in a world where, is it going to rain? Or can I have kids? And you've got these little trinkets, these little god and goddesses you could get out and come in and say, no, just one.
Yeah.
The Lord covers all of that. That's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. And Israel struggled to make that shift. The history of the Old Testament is like that. They're always constantly going back to that.
To an image or something.
To an image or to a God who they think is going to work. Because sometimes, God doesn't quite act on our time scale. You say,
it seems as if he rarely does.
You're like, I could really do with this week, and the Lord's going, in a few years. But that's just the reality, and the temptation. Our temptation today is then, let's deal with it ourselves.
Yeah.
Their temptation back then would be, I'm supposed to have got rid of it, but under my mattress, I've got a little fertility goddess. Let's try that.
Yeah.
It's heinous and it's wrong and things, but it's it's understandable.
Yeah.
In that culture, that's what they're used to.
Yeah. I think one of the really helpful things when you're just thinking about sacrifice and the distinction between the pagan world and what God commands the Israelites is it does help give you categories for what faith is, and how that manifests itself in a culture, because it would really require faith to take an animal, which would be not insignificant, and go and offer it and somehow believe that is going to do something. And that, I can imagine someone just saying, there is no clean, unclean distinction. You guys are all delusional. Now, you might find out if you get close. Yeah. But you can see it takes some level of faith to take God at his word when he says, I want you to be holy the way I'm holy, and here's how. Yeah. And kind of the first action chapter, if we're just reading from Genesis through, we get is the death of Nadab and Abihu, who they're this cautionary tale of what happens if you don't take this holiness thing seriously. Yeah. So first, can you just tell us, what was the sin of Nadab and Abihu? What do we know within the text? And maybe if there's things you'd want to...
Well, you have, by those who draw near me, I must be regarded as holy, and I must be honored amongst the people. So there's a general declaration by God by why, they didn't consider me as holy,
Yeah.
and they didn't honor me in front of the people. So that is now there is there are hints later that alcohol may be involved.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I don't think it's completely clear that they were walking in there
Mm-hmm.
drunk. That's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
The explicit thing is, for whatever reason, they did not take seriously what they were doing.
Yeah.
Which is really striking, because they went up the mount.
Yeah.
They were in Exodus 3, but they were up there, and it says they ate and drank, and they saw God up the mount, through this see-through
Yeah.
blue sapphire
Rainbow.
floor of the whatever it was,
Yeah.
the vision. Moses desperately trying to sort of harness whatever language and pictures he could try and communicate something. They were there.
Yeah.
So they had experienced what only 68 others had experienced, excluding Moses. Everyone else had just been at the bottom of the mount.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew the terror.
Yeah.
So it's striking that how quickly it's almost the first it was the first act in the tabernacle after the consecration of Aaron and his family. You have the two sons sort of seemingly saunter in and offer strange fire as if they can just come in any old time.
Yeah.
And God goes, bang, no.
Yeah.
Now it strikes me what an interesting parallel is, for me, is Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah.
Because you have Pentecost, which is this Sinai-like event in the upper room with the fire and the smoke and the at the feast where you're celebrating the giving of the Torah. Mm-hmm. You have all these nations come in, and almost you have a little bit of narrative, then almost immediately you have two thinking, this is a good deal. I can sell a bit of land, I can give a little bit and get some kudos from everyone, and God strikes them dead. Mm-hmm. The sort of narrative similarity is quite striking.
Yeah.
And I think it's just for whatever reason, and it's a mystery to me on one level. Nadab and Abihu thought they could just do it their way. Mm-hmm. They could walk in any time, maybe because they were puffed up because of the experiences they had. Mm-hmm. Up the mountain, they were the priestly family. Pride entered in. All those things are possible. Mm-hmm. And they didn't regard God as holy. And God will not abide that. Mm-hmm. Whether drink was involved or not, I don't know. But that is the striking thing. When God takes up residence in the camp, it doesn't mean you can, like say, you can come in and stick your shoes on the table.
Yeah. So back in Exodus, when they do go up on the mount, God has this kind of, it sounds weird to us, he says, don't even let an animal go up on it. Mm. And if the tabernacle is this portable holy mountain where it's kind of like the mountain laid flat, no animal comes in unless it's killed. Yeah. So do you see a connection there between the animals have to be sacrificed and they're burned up, and what God is communicating at the mountain is essentially the same thing, and that principle is holding over where they're up in the most holy place of sorts, and
I think that parallel does work. It's not an exact likeness. When you sort of turn the mountain flat and you see the entrance to the tabernacle, people have tried to make that claim. Some people are less convinced of it than others, but mm-hmm. clearly the presence of God on the mountain, the presence of God in the tabernacle, and only certain people can go in certain places. Mm-hmm. And what's striking is in the tabernacle, the clothing of the people who can go into certain places match the the fabrics of the tabernacle in that place. So there's clearly a strong correlation between the two, and there are gradations of holiness. And even when you get into the Holy of Holies once a year, you still have these cherubim, which aren't particularly warm and friendly, inviting figures. They're almost there, also protecting God's holiness. So there's awe and wonder and majesty attached to tabernacle the same way as a thing. In terms of animals not coming up the mountain and animals being sacrificed at the door, it fits, it works. You can't.
If you were a bird just flying at the wrong time,
and clearly the details of the sacrificial system are pedagogical. Like Mary Douglas, who's a British she's died a few years ago, a British anthropologist who I think started learning Hebrew in her retirement in order to write a book on Leviticus from a point of view of anthropology. Which is,
so if you think about retirement,
think about retirement.
things to
do.
She
didn't collect shells. She learned Hebrew.
John Piper would be proud.
Yes. And she compared the sacrificial system in Leviticus and to the other sacrificial things, how it worked, and there's very specific order.
Yeah.
All of that is teaching you something about the world and structures in the world, and that some stuff you can't partake in whatsoever, and the fat belongs to God.
Yeah.
In a similar way, it says there's a kill. Everyone steps back, the chief walks up and goes, I'll have those bits, thank you very much. And then there's a hierarchy, and, little Fred who's, so I got the tail.
Yeah.
Or whatever it was.
Yeah. God gets the prime rib.
God gets, the fat, the best of it. And that teaches Israel something.
Yeah.
We can't, Ecclesiastes says, you draw near to God, let your words be few. We've got very comfortable with an ease and
being casual.
Casualness in relationship to worship, in relationship to the things of God.
Yeah.
And no Israelite would ever have got to that point, or if they did, as Nadab and Abihu did early on,
You'd smoked.
Yeah, you got smoked, and that was everyone understood that. But God doesn't always do that. You don't always die. There are some people who have been Eli's sons.
Yeah. You kind of wish they would have, right?
Yeah, you think, Lord, Nadab and Abihu, what happened? These guys are doing terrible things. They make Nadab and Abihu look like saints.
Yeah.
And yet God has sort of put up with it, it seems, patiently for a time, and then judgment comes.
Yeah.
And so there, we often think, and I think there's a sort of inner Marcionite in every Christian, which is, but thinks the Old Testament is really nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
And actually, the fulfillment of all these things, it's not that they are done away with. It's just that they are fulfilled and internalized in a way that takes now the events of Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension. Okay, so fulfilling the commandment to be fruitful and multiply requires sexual relations, which requires you to be impure, which means you cannot go to the tabernacle.
Yeah.
There's a question in early Christianity: can one have a sexual relationship and still pray and still be spiritual? And the answer is, of course, yes. But it's not because the impurity isn't the issue now. It's because the Spirit of God now dwells in us, has translated us into a sanctuary of His holiness, and that is more powerful. That destroys any ritual impurity that we might have undertaken. So there was still, early Christians were still thinking in terms of sanctuary, temple, purity, impurity, as well, not just moral impurity, although that was part of it. And they're taking all these categories and saying they're not they're done away with. We've got to internalize those realities in light of what has happened in light of, in one sense, Easter and Pentecost. And they work them out. That's why the church didn't get rid of the Old Testament. They could have done it.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh, Jesus has come now. We don't need that." And they go, "No, Jesus has come now. We need that because we have to understand what's going on."
Yeah.
I remember having a conversation with a education inspector in Oxford because we were home educating. Once a year they would come through.
Yeah.
And he wasn't really interested in what we were doing in home education for numerous reasons. But he looked around, and we had a menorah because we lived in Israel, so we had various stuff, and they saw that all our kids were learning Hebrew, or not all of them, but some of them were learning Hebrew. And he said, "So what's with all this Jewish stuff?" And so we started talking, and he said to me, he said, "So you think it was a good idea to keep the Old Testament?" And I said, "It was a very good idea." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "How do you know what Jesus' sacrifice accomplished if you don't have Leviticus?" He said, "If you don't have Leviticus, we have no idea why Jesus died."
Yeah.
Because it says his death was a sacrifice that fulfilled all of those sacrifices, every single one of them. From the Yom Kippur to the Azazel, the scapegoat, to the sin offering, to the free will offering, everything. They all find their fulfillment and meaning and purpose in this one sacrifice. In other words, so how are you going to understand what Jesus did as a Christian if you haven't got Leviticus? And he was like, I hadn't thought of that, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Clearly.
Yes. Clearly. It was a good idea to keep the Old Testament. It was a giveaway question on that front. But we also have to be honest, when we read Leviticus, we feel like we're in a completely different universe to the one that we inhabit. And we need to fill that foreignness. In other words, the Bible is not as straightforward and as simple a book to read as sometimes we make it out to be.
Yeah.
And the God who struck down Nadab and Abihu has not changed. And we need to realize that.
Yeah, he still kills people. So thinking about this idea of worship, and then Hebrews is going to say things have been actually ramped up now. Like if you spurn this blood, that actually is for the forgiveness of sins. The judgment's going to be way worse. Can you talk about principles from even a story like this? So this is one of the proof texts for the so-called regulative principle of worship, and Reformed people argue about what you can and can't do in worship. But so we in the CREC have this kind of covenant renewal worship. We look at Leviticus and say, yeah, we kind of have this order of service. Can you talk about what lessons the church should take away from Leviticus when it comes to what worship should be like on Sunday?
Well, I think the most general and basic principle is, the one we've talked about quite a lot, is that we don't get to do what we think we want to do just the way we want to do it. God comes and dwells in Israel and says, and I get to say how it's done.
Yeah.
So that's the first principle. God is holy, and he needs to be considered as such to draw near to him. Secondly, then you go, okay, so what in the structure of Old Testament worship, which didn't stay the same throughout the whole of the Old Testament? I mean, there's no mention of singing or even any words in the tabernacle and the temple liturgy. David introduced singing, and so that there is development over time, and the temple looked a little bit different, under Solomon, certainly by the time of Jesus and Herod's temple.
Yeah.
So there is development. So we have to be careful to not go, we're going to take one particular historical, cultural moment of that biblical worship and then transplant it as best we can. So we have to allow that to teach us about what is important in God's mind in terms of those who want to draw near him and worship him, and acknowledging that he is holy, and dealing with sin right at the door, right at the beginning, is a basic principle, and all the way through the history of the people of God and their worship in the temple. And so it's the challenge is, how do you take a system and a cult which is foreign and different, involves inordinate amounts of blood and sacrifice. What is it God is teaching his people from that, and what can we take and apply in our context? And I think there's the work that in the CRC and that Doug and others have done in terms of that liturgical move is a good example of doing it. It's not necessarily the only way that it can be done, but I think it's a good way of thinking biblically about worship in the 21st century, and in terms of its order and structure, because we should be saying that this should teach us something. The way we go through our worship on a Sunday morning is not simply a warm up to the sermon and then a warm down before we leave. And the person who's leading that service is not the MC of a meeting.
Right.
We're being taught something about God all the way through, and how God wants us to approach him. And Leviticus and Numbers and the Torah as a whole, and examples of worship in the temple and narrative books, Kings and others are helpful.
Yeah, I think that when I read a book like Leviticus and compare it to whether that's Westminster's Directory for Public Worship or just what other churches are doing, you do read this and you just come away with like, okay, this is a big deal. like worship is a big deal, holiness is a big deal, and if we're actually worshiping the consuming fire, Hebrews 12, then we should, if anything, we should come with even more reverence than, well, certainly more than Nadab and Abihu, but the kind of fear and trembling that the Israelites had at the mountain, and certainly it's different, but it does, I think, strike at some of the casualness of modern worship, and then we wonder, where is the power? Where is the favor and blessing of God? It seems like maybe this is the place to start. When you read the curses and the blessings, and you're like, it sounds more like we're getting the curses than the blessings. Maybe we should go back and say, okay, how are we worshiping God, and are we treating him lightly or not? Probably the most significant chapter, some would say maybe in the whole Pentateuch, is chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. This is like the very center of the book. And so some people have heard this idea of the scapegoat. Can you just talk about the function of this ritual? So God has this special day, and this is the one day of fasting in the whole, they could fast if they wanted to, but this is the one commanded day of afflicting yourself, and atonement is made. Why does atonement have to be made, and what is the function of this strange ritual?
It involves all sorts of, it involves this going out and the goat that got the lot on it, taking it out to a mountain and being sent to where you have the red heifer whose neck is broken in a valley. I mean, that is hard. I mean, I don't know how they do that. It's certainly not in a way that would please anyone who cares for it. There's an excessive.
I thought wringing the head of the bird was bad, but it gets worse.
Yes, yeah. So there's, and it's marked out, because it happens in the same, a few days before Tabernacles. Yeah. You have the Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, which is the one New Year festival that's marked out with a trumpet blast.
We're coming up on that. I think it's tomorrow or 2 days from now.
Yeah, so they're called the High Holy Days in the modern Jewish tradition. So it's marked out as the day where the sins of Israel are dealt with. Which you think, well, hold on, if they've been doing the sacrificial system all the time, again, it's just another end. There's no way to. Yeah. These things don't deal with sin.
Yeah.
But you need to deal with it.
Yeah.
And you need to have something that keeps going. Why a goat being released? No idea. Really? Why a red heifer and not any old cow.
Yeah.
Because God says so. Let's put it that. It seems to me there are people will go into great detail as reasons why. I haven't gone into that detail. It seems to me that's what God says, and that's what was required.
Yeah.
And you had to fast and afflict your soul. Again, it's teaching Israel. A holy God is in their midst, and there's no way to avoid that holiness and the consequences of that for you, your life.
Mm-hmm.
And one day a year when absolutely everything stops. No food, no drink, everything is.
Yeah.
It is it's very strange. I mean, we lived in Israel for 3 years. Yom Kippur is a very remarkable day. Literally everything stops. There's no cars on the road, except the odd.
What do they do now?
They have a very strong synagogal liturgy on the night before, and then they fast for the day, but a lot of the time people are just wandering around, empty streets.
Yeah,
it's very, very striking. But they've got this whole thing now that the days before Yom Kippur, you're meant to be between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You're making sure you're putting everything right.
Yeah.
Because there's the idea that God is
different books,
and God is going to whether you're going to be.
There's the Book of Life, the Book of Death. No, there's one other one, isn't there?
Yeah, I can't remember all the books.
Book of like purgatory kind of thing. Like God will give you another year to.
But there's this desire to and the need to go and actually put things right with people.
Yeah.
So in one sense, it's a liturgical, I hate to put it that way, memorial of what a normal holy life should look like.
Mm-hmm.
But you're just saying, you make sure you do it now. We should be doing that all the time.
Yeah.
In that regard. But Israel had this yearly reminder.
Yeah.
It should, in one sense, the liturgical calendar, Leviticus 23 has the yearly calendar, is saying you've got to remember every week, every certain months, certain things. These are important things. If you forget any of these things, the chances of you straying are very high.
Yeah, the Day of Atonement is also when the Jubilee would take into effect.
The Jubilee, yes, the Jubilee and the year of Shemitah, the year of release, every 7 years, and then the big Jubilee, yes.
So it's like even on non-Jubilee or every 7 years, you are still having this settling accounts kind of impulse, and then it's special every 50 or 7 years. Chapters 18 to 20 is where we get the kind of strange and fun laws to figure out, is this ceremonial, is this moral? And we're going to argue about tattoos and beards and stuff like that. Any comments on how we approach these laws when it does seem like some are mixed, and then some people are like, so a woman on her menstrual cycle, for example, it's like, okay, you couldn't have relations then, and people say, yeah, this is a moral thing still now, Christians shouldn't do this, and some say, no, that was a ceremonial thing. So these are people that disagree over this, who do believe that Christ has come. Suggestions, ideas for how we should approach some of these questions in Leviticus.
I mean, the most striking thing is that the second commandment is hidden away in these chapters. The second greatest commandment.
Yeah,
thou shalt
people
love thy
forget
neighbor as
that.
thyself, is the second half of some verse that doesn't seem to be in it's in chapter 19, isn't it? I think it's 18.
Yeah, it's you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
I am your Lord. So there's the second greatest commandment.
Yeah.
Hidden away in a verse about retaliation or not, or and how you deal with someone who wrongs you.
So that applies still.
Clearly, and because at the end of that chapter, isn't repeated, but it's related to how you should treat foreigners. Mm-hmm. Clearly, Jesus says in the parable of the Good Samaritan, you shall love your neighbour as yourself, or who's my neighbour. Well, you need to read the end of the chapter, because, in other words, so Jesus, in his dispute with it, obviously it's a Jewish halachic discussion that's going on in terms of the interpretation of the law. He's saying the whole chapter is important in relation to answering that question. So clearly, we need to read it, and we need to read it carefully and wisely. The application of some laws and not others in relationship to a Christian's behaviour now is a thorny issue, and in one sense you take it as on a case by case basis. I understand and have some sympathy with the tripartite division of the law. It's clearly not set out in a tripartite section. It's all considered important.
Yeah, it's all Torah.
It's all Torah. Yeah. And James says, you break any part of the law, you break all of the law. And so it's a body of commandments. But I also think we often understand Torah in terms of law in a way that it's not written to be understood that way. And what do I mean by that? I think we see it as sort of statutory law.
Yeah. Don't
do this, and therefore, and that stands all the way through. But it doesn't ever function like that in any consistent way in the scriptures.
Yeah.
It functions more like case law, is how it's described, because, I say this to my students quite regularly. Okay, let's put you all on a desert island. Okay, let's give you the 613 commandments, because that's what there are in the Torah. 613 commandments. Organize your society around that. I said, how long is it going to be before you're in factions? Because the Bible tells you not to work on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And if the death penalty is the consequence for working on the Sabbath, what work means is quite important.
Yeah.
But it's not defined.
Yeah.
Starting a fire is in the narrative section. So, okay, starting a fire, I'm not allowed to do that. And then later on, there's doing business or carrying burdens on the Sabbath, and you go, well, where did those interpretations come from? How did that happen? And so there's in one sense, there's all these laws are there, but there's also the necessity or the freedom to apply those laws in each given circumstance, by the precedents that they set in each given circumstance. And therefore, when we say, does that still apply today? You go, absolutely, it still applies today, but not how you think necessarily, in that sense.
Yeah.
And that obviously isn't true for the ceremonial laws, and we don't have a temple, we don't have, so the sacrifices are, we don't have to worry about that in a day-to-day, Sunday to Sunday worship. But I think the rest of Torah, we have to read carefully and wisely and ask, well, Lord, how does that? Christ has fulfilled this. He has filled it up into its fullest sense. What does that mean today in terms of how I live and act, and in terms of what it means to be faithful to Him?
Yeah. I want to close talking about the year of Jubilee, which is towards the end, chapter 25. And this is one of those chapters that often now in modern day can be misused or just kind of ripped into meaning all sorts of social programs or agendas. Can you first just talk about what was the function of this Jubilee law and its uniqueness to Israel, the connection to Christ's coming, and then maybe say, is there any, or what would be maybe a potential application for us from
So the Jubilee year is the pinnacle of the Sabbath principle. So Israel is told to rest every 7 days from their work. And then there are special Sabbaths on various festival days. So throughout the year, you have a principle of rest, of Sabbath. there, and that cycle goes through, and then the 7th year of that cycle is a Sabbath year where
for the land,
and either debts are released completely then, or the repayment on debts are released. If they're released then the Sabbath year debt release doesn't make a lot of sense. So there is a release on some form of debt repayments. And then every 7-year cycles you have the Jubilee, the super Sabbath. So ingrained within this 50-year cycle, Israel is being said, remember the Sabbath. Sabbath is important. Sabbath. And the prophets tell us that the Sabbath is a sign to Israel. So they're trying to be told something by all these Sabbaths and super Sabbaths and super Sabbaths. And what is it? That I am the God who sanctifies you. That's the sign of the Sabbath. So Israel has been told, here's the Torah, here's the law. Just stop doing stuff regularly, all the time, because you need to realize it's I that sanctify you. You don't get sanctify yourself. So there's a fundamental gospel principle embedded in the Jubilee as the super Sabbath. It's you get the sense that God understands that this is going to be a difficult concept for Israel and for people. They need to be reminded all the time. So I think that's how I would say the overarching principle of Jubilee. Now in that 49th, 50th year, there is no working of the land. Any indentured slave, Israelite slave, is freed. Anyone who's lost their ancestral plot of land in Israel can return to that plot of land. So it's like everyone goes back to go. And let's start again.
Reset.
It's a whole reset, yes. Anyone who's down and out gets to start again. Now, 50 years is a long time back then. When you think of life expectancy and all those sorts of things, but it's still a reset. But the point is, I am the God who sanctifies you. And also the point is, they said, the land is not yours, it's mine. Because it's teaching Israel something about who God is in relationship to God. Now, if we take the idea that the land of Israel is, in one sense, an earnest of universal redemption, and the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof, that principle then, if we're going to start asking, is there a principle for us today in how we live and politically and things? Obviously, we don't have a Christian civil society with a government and Josephus, I think, was the first person describing the rule of the Bible to Romans, described as a theocracy. We don't have that. So there's not too much we can. You can't just blindly pick it up and pop it down again.
Cancel all student loan debt.
That's the thing. But I think that we should ask the question: what does it mean? What does it mean? And how does the principle of Jubilee? If we just spiritualize it and go, oh no, it just pointed to Christ. It's now all fulfilled in Christ, and that all my debts, spiritual debts, are released, and all my losses have been cancelled. You go, yeah, that's also very true. So how are you going to teach that to the person who owes you lots of money? Who's down and out? How are you going to deal with that? Has it got anything to say to that? You at least have to ask that question. Because the principle that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, if you're a landowner, you have to go, I don't own this. Ultimately, this is the Lord's land. He can do with it what he wants. And I need to treat it in such a way. And again, let's go back to